What's up, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Well Man's Podcast. My name is Brian Brosey. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Keoni Tita. Keoni, how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. I'm excited about this podcast today
Yes.
because it's something that I really enjoy talking about, and that's basically, I don't know, I guess I'd call it a primer in genetics and inheritance.
Yeah.
And I just finished reading a book that I really love. It was given to me by a friend anyway. It's called Evolution in Four Dimensions by Ivan Jablonka and Miriam J. Lamb, both PhDs. And I read the book, and it kind of tied everything in for me as far as my understanding with, genetics and Darwinism and Lamarckianism, stuff like that. So why don't we just
Yeah, let's
start?
jump right into it. Genetics is one of those things that's always been difficult for me, Keoni. It's like it makes sense when I see the two seeds and the one seed that's wrinkly or however they
Right,
describe it. And then after that,
right.
I'm like, oh, man.
Yeah, I want to be even more general than that because I don't even want to get into Mendelian genetics
Awesome.
stuff, although that plays a role. But look around us, and what can we say is the only constant around us? And basically, on Heraclitus, ancient philosopher, I think he was, yeah, he was a philosopher, but ancient philosopher that just basically said the only constant in life is change.
Mm.
Well, everything changes, or another word for that is evolves. And that is the only constant in the known universe. So nothing is the same. So even in our own bodies, we're not the same person we were a second ago because certain cells have been taken away. After about 7 years, we're a completely different person. Everything's been replaced.
Yeah.
You're constantly changing, you're aging. And I think he was the one who also said you can never stick your foot in the same river, again.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah.
it's constantly
Because you are not
flowing.
the same and the river is neither the same.
Right. It's constantly flowing. So the thing that me and you learned in biology class and everybody else learned is really what's called the central dogma of molecular biology. And it basically states that DNA makes RNA, which then makes proteins. And based on your genetics, whatever set of genes you have, they express themselves, and they express themselves as the person you are.
Yeah.
Right. And we found just recently, like in the, I don't know, early 60s, maybe 50s, stuff like that, that it's not just all about genes. We know that environment plays a huge role in that.
Mm.
And then you have this whole thing about the science of epigenetics and structural inheritance and behavioral inheritance, which I'll just talk about briefly. But before we get to that, one of my heroes, as I've said before, is Charles Darwin himself, because the main reason is he basically let all of us humans know in 1859 when he published his book, on origins of species, where we all came from.
Yeah.
Right. So no longer do we have to, just make up stuff. Everybody has their own creation story. Just make up stuff. Like, we have science to basically tell us. And the theory of evolution is a theory, but it's a theory that is as much of a theory as the Earth is not flat.
Right.
So it's written and it's
We're pretty
solid.
sure.
Yeah, we're pretty sure. We're pretty sure about it. Anyway, he put this together, in a very concise and elegant way. And it's just funny, I just said, look around us. And if you observe nature, and that's pretty much what he was doing.
Yeah.
It's like almost slaps you upside the face in a sense, like, damn, why did it take humans until, the mid 19th century to figure out where we came from? Because it seems pretty obvious once
Yeah.
that, that we're kind of all related. I mean, you could look at a bird, you look at the bird's wings and you see the human hand. You look at whales' fins, you see the same bone structures. You look at a dog, you see the same bone structures, and yada 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 as far as mammals go. And we didn't, we saw how things were related. And based on that, we would classify different groups of animals based on how they related, based on bone structure. And that served us pretty well. But the thing that really served us is when we found out what the hell DNA is, right? Watson and Crick.
Yes.
And then once we found that Yeah, on a molecular level, we are all related, and based on that code, we can tell uh, where we've all kind of branched off. We can kind of back calculate, and we can see that we're all related to everything, and we all have common ancestors.
Yeah.
So, so anyway, his whole thing was, you know, Darwinism is basically that species evolve based on random mutations that kind of get selected or directed into species adapting to their environment, right? So let me give you an example of that. Let's say something like a lizard back in prehistoric times could jump really far compared to his other lizard peers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he needed to do that because they had predators, and he could jump, he could jump away quicker, and he actually survived and was able to procreate, and then his progeny was also able to do that
Yeah.
based on a genetic nick in the DNA, right?
Yeah.
He got luck of the draw, so to speak. And that's kind of and that's where we get the random mutation whole thing from Darwinism.
Yeah, it's an interesting random factoid, Keoni. It's
Yeah.
somewhat relevant, but this year in like the NFL draft, it was like the highest number of people drafted that are from a family that had played in the NFL before. Like
Yeah. I
25,
mean,
26 sort of people in the entire draft who had already
yeah,
played.
yeah, it's pretty neat. And
Mm-hmm.
you'll see some of these things run in families. And it may not just be based on the random mutations of genetics or pure Darwinism, which now we know is not exactly true, right? So now we have
Right.
something called NeoDarwinism.
Right.
And again, Darwin, this is 1859. He had no concept of what a gene was or anything like that. So you
Absolutely.
can, right. So you can think of neo-Darwinism as incorporating Mendelian genetics and also discovery of genes and how they're inherited and all that stuff.
So they're just
But
taking both things into consideration now.
yeah,
Now that we got the
yes,
tech.
right. Basically, his theory is evolving and continues to evolve today, and that's why I wanted to do this. Well, just a little bit before he was well aware. This man, his name's Lamarck. I'm sure you've heard of Lamarckianism, right?
I have.
So the example that's given in the textbooks, in the biology textbooks, is that of a giraffe, right? During the giraffe's lifetime, they keep reaching higher for the trees, and over time, because they're reaching so much and doing that so much, that their genes then change to create in their progeny longer neck giraffes. So with each progeny or each generation reaching higher for those leaves, those necks get longer. Well, we know that that's not true. It doesn't work that way. So you're not, but we also know that he wasn't exactly wrong either with his theory. So then you also have something called neo-Lamarckianism. Okay, and basically this is just it's similar in the effect that now we're getting into the realm of epigenetics, which means that your environment plays a significant role. And basically with epigenetics, your environment has the power to turn on and off genes, not necessarily change them. Okay. So for example, a real life example, well, like a bodybuilder,
Yeah.
they're expressing their muscle building genes because they are constantly lifting weights and stuff more so than somebody like me who doesn't lift as much as they
Mm-hmm.
do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can see um, you can see this in the way they appear, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So the
Which
difference
is called their
between
phenotype.
that original Lamarckism, Keoni, and then neo-Lamarckism is kind of the original almost had like a 1, 2, 3, 4 easy, understandable one-step approach. One giraffe had a really long neck. It had a baby that had an even longer neck and so on and so forth to fit the environment better. And neo-Lamarckism is saying that the environment has more of a role in how those genes are expressed than just, what you got from your father giraffe.
Right.
Okay.
And and there is this belief that that you can consciously change your genes based on what you're doing, right? So think about, okay, so you can't go out there and lift weights and then all of a sudden you can change your, you get another, I don't know, you change your genetics so that you're building more protein and muscle. That's not what's going on. You're set with your genes. The act of lifting actually turns on and off genes so that you build more muscle and get in shape. This is what exercise does. Anything that you're practicing or doing.
Okay, so it almost makes sense to kind of think of it like a circuit board. And you ever seen like one of those producer circuit boards with all the volumes you can turn up and down? If
Yeah.
you're weightlifting, you kind of turn those circuits up at that moment, but they're also, you can turn them back down by not exercising, or so on and so forth.
Right. That's a good way to think about it. But think about the environment having an impact.
Having the impact. Okay.
Yeah. Think about the environment having an impact. So it's and you can see that sounds kind of like, that's why they call it neo-Lamarckianism, right? So he's not shelved anymore. I mean, when I was in high school, it was like, yeah, this guy was completely wrong, and he didn't, they just contrasted him with Darwin, who was completely right, and that's not true. Now we're finding that it's a mix of both.
Yeah, as we typically see.
Yeah, as we typically see. Is exactly right. Just stepping back a little bit, also, this theory of evolution just didn't come out of the blue for Darwin, right? I mean, it was built upon like people like Lamarck and people that came before him. And in fact, there was somebody, his contemporary named Alfred Russel Wallace, that I want to bring up, because he independently, at the same time Darwin was going through this, came up with the same theory of evolution. All right. And it's really interesting. He actually was in contact with Darwin, and it's just really interesting how Darwin got all the kudos, and he kind of is like the secondary person. And it's just how that played out. Yeah. But they both independently came up with this theory at the same time. I mean, it was Darwin who got the book out and got it published first, so of course he gets the credit.
Yeah. It always works the same. That's almost where the river quote goes away.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, we can have a whole podcast on how many women have come up with stuff there, like Watson and Crick. I mean, I think her name was Rosalind Franklin, actually came up or had a significant part. Oh yeah. Had a significant part in coming up with the structure of DNA, and didn't get any credit for, like, certainly not like Watson and Crick did. And she was the actual one who, I think she actually took the pictures of it and saw it firsthand. Wow. And all that. But anyway, the history is,
got to get a YouTube channel. Got to get vocal.
Yeah, that's right.
Got to get millions of views.
Yep, that's
you right. You want to
be right. that's right. But yeah, you see that throughout history, especially in science, with women kind of being pushed off to the side. And hopefully that's going to be. Hopefully that's changing. It is changing slowly, but not fast enough. Anyway, so those are just little primers on Darwinism and Lamarckian evolution. Just to reiterate, let me give you an example of what would be a good example of Darwinian evolution. I would say, well, another example, think of the peacock, right? And actually Darwin brought this up quite a bit. The male peacock basically is very colorful. He's not, he seems like he's built to be a show-off, hence the name peacock, right? Mm-hmm. And he really is. And the whole thing is he's built to be very colorful and show his feathers and all that to get the girl, right?
Yeah. Feathers bring all the girls to the yard.
Right. So in Darwinian evolution, the prettiest male got the girl, so to speak. And then that trait, through random mutations, was passed on. And then over time, you have these beautiful plumages of male peacocks who, the prettier they are, the better they get, the better mating they have. Yeah. And you see this in birds in general, right? You tend to see the male birds tend to be like the more colorful type, because it's all for getting the girl and
Yep, being
maybe,
attractive.
right. And
Yeah.
they're saying that's basically due to random mutations. Well, we know that may not necessarily be true based on what we've just heard from
The
the epigenetics and
neo-Lamarckian.
the environment and how all that plays. And this is the big downside to evolution, is because how can you get all these species on purely genetic mutations which don't happen that often anyway, and then you have a correcting system in DNA? So there has to be something else going on, right? So what else? Another example would be like the antlers of the male deer, right?
Mm-hmm.
The biggest antlers, the baddest antlers, kind of gets the girl, can kind of fight off the other males, gets the harem, so to speak.
Yeah.
And based on random mutations, the antlers get bigger and better, and so on and so on. Let's see.
What do we know about like human genetics, and as far as I'm sure little at this point, but as far as how that plays a role in how the environment brings out certain things in us?
Well, that's a great question, and here's one very, very good example of that. As humans started building into communities and stuff, we started domesticating animals. So think about the environmental pressure, and at some point, somewhere along the way, a certain group of humans started drinking the milk of those animals, okay, and as a food source. Some people do very poorly drinking milk because it's full of lactose. They can't digest it. They don't have an enzyme to digest it. However, maybe based on that pressure of somebody having an enzyme that allows them to digest milk, and maybe that was the only food source around the time. So the people that can really digest dairy products very well are Northern Europeans, and some groups of people around the Mediterranean, and some little small pockets in Africa and stuff. Well, if you can digest milk and that's your only food source, well, guess what? Your brethren who can't digest it are going to be sickly and not going to be able to procreate and stuff like that. This
Right.
is and they say that's based on a mutation. And now that mutation got passed on. So somebody like me, got passed on to me, probably to you also. Can you drink milk without any digestive issues?
Yeah, as far as I know, God knows the
Yeah.
last time I had real milk.
Yeah. Well, so I can,
Uh-huh.
and I'm talking about milk. I mean, a lot of people can digest cheese pretty good, but there's not a whole lot of lactose in cheese, whereas in milk there is.
Mm-hmm.
So people who drink milk can really, really have a problem. And the other interesting thing about that is lactose. Most of the milk drinking peoples are from northern latitudes, right? And what we find is uh, that lactose, the milk and lactose, also helps you to absorb vitamin D better. So that's interesting too, right? So northern
Right.
latitudes, you're not getting a lot of sunlight, but based on this mutation, you can also get more vitamin D via food. So that's interesting. But that's an example with humans.
Well, the first part of that, it seems more like the Darwinism, where you pass on that kind of genetic mutation to be able
Right.
to sustain yourself off the milk or digest it properly. And then the second half makes a lot more sense as far as that the neo-Lamarckism, where the environment is having much more of a greater effect, where you kind of have that
Right.
benefit of being on that northern latitude of digesting or synthesizing vitamin D and being able to digest the milk and
Right.
have
And
that
then
added benefit.
right. Right. And then and because of that, and if you're able to do that, you're going to be more likely to pass on your genes,
Mm-hmm.
which is what it's really all about. Like there's another book that came out, some seminal book called The Selfish Gene by
Okay.
Richard Dawkins. And it's all about, your body, your body is basically just a vehicle to pass on genes.
Yeah.
So what's the truly immortal part? It's the gene, not you, you know?
Oof.
I know. So right. So it's
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing, but that's what gets passed on. I mean, me and you, if we go back far enough, our genes will find a common mother, a common father if we go back far enough.
Yeah.
That's
Mm-hmm.
what gets passed on. But the genes are not static, right?
Right.
They're not static. Some can be turned on, some can be turned off. There's mutations. There's little marks that can be put on the genes. Like genes are basically in what we call chromosomes, and those chromosomes have things on them like methyl groups, like histones, like proteins. They have proteins that read back and forth, and all these things can change and suppress genes, or sometimes what we see is sometimes those genes are completely taken out of the picture. And
Right.
then you have all this, then you have, a lot of our DNA is what we're finding is viral DNA. So then based on where you're exposed, if you're exposed to viruses, which we constantly are, hence the COVID virus, sometimes the viral DNA gets incorporated in there. So that also plays a role in how genes may get expressed and how evolution happens further on down, like a million
Yeah.
years from now, based on all that.
Yeah.
So anyway,
It's
but
fascinating.
yeah, so it's really about, the immortal part of you that wants to be passed on, so to speak, you can think about is the gene. But it's not, that book is incredible book, and I recommend people read The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, but it's not the end all be all. That book was written like 40 years ago, and it's been updated again, but there's a lot of science that's happened already.
Yeah. Yeah. This is one of the topics where you go to bed and you wake up and there's something new.
Yeah, right. And the reason why I want to bring this up, and I'll go over it, but we're talking about DNA here, and this impacts our lives at every single level, just about. When as we're talking about, because we're talking about environment affecting it, and then we're talking about like, well, wow, if we know as much as we can about our DNA and how things are expressed, well, think about the diseases we can cure. Think about what we can do to manipulate that code and stuff like that. It's very, very important. Think about how we can use it to shut off infections and things like that.
Right.
So it's fascinating stuff, and I know a lot of people, and I'm no expert on it, but I do think a lot of people, just blow it off and think, oh well, it's just something out there. A lot of people know Noah's Ark story as far as creation much better than they know this, when this is the truth. This is the fact. This is what's going on, and I guess it's for some people that think they know, they don't know. That's
Yeah.
well, hence a lot of the problems in the world. You don't know what you don't know,
Yeah.
but you think you know it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So anyway, and that's getting back to what we were discussing before. This is one of the reasons why I love doing these podcasts, because they're very educational for me. Hopefully we transfer that on to other people, right?
There are genes going out into the internet.
Yeah, it's like the knowledge is hopefully being inherited. Somebody hopefully will take it and manipulate it and
Absolutely.
add the new info to it, right?
Absolutely.
Like we said, everything evolves. Everything evolves. So let's see. Oh yeah. So you wanted to know about the Lamarckian example of stuff, right? Well, just real briefly, a Lamarckian example of stuff would be, okay, a human child growing up in an abusive household. Okay. How does that affect genes being turned on and turned off, right? So they're probably going to be under a tremendous amount of stress. They're probably going to be very anxious. Later on, they're going to be very depressed. They're going to be more likely to have abusive relationships or not well-formed relationships. They're going to be a little bit socially inept, so on and so on. And what we're finding is they may be able to pass that on to their kids, even if their kids were raised in a good environment. All right, that's what we're finding with rodent studies, and we'll get into that in just a minute.
Yeah.
So one generation of abuse can be transferred on, not necessarily by putting mutations in the DNA, but by adding marks to the DNA that cause the DNA to be read and expressed differently. Right?
Wow. Okay. So we're hitting nature versus nurture, and we're blurring the lines real hard.
Oh yeah. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Well, and we'll go over this at the end. I just want to go over it because I want to put real world examples on this for people, so people can understand it. But
absolutely,
I just want, yeah. But we just basically went over briefly like two types of evolution, but based on the book that I mentioned at the beginning, 4 Dimensions of Evolution, there's 4 types of evolution. One is genetic inheritance, right? You can think about that as think about it as like the NeoDarwinism inheritance, think about that as the Darwin. Epigenetic inheritance is another one, right? Think about that as like, oh, kind of neo-Lamarckianism. But the terms are not the same, but you can think about it that way to make it easier for you to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
But genetic inheritance is basically the genes are passed on, right? The genes
Yeah.
are inherited. Epigenetic inheritance is basically the transmission of what we call like little little marks on the DNA that cause the DNA to be read in such a different way. So these marks, what are they? We can think of the one that's most studied is methyl groups putting on the DNA,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
We've actually talked about this on some podcasts about methyl groups
Yes.
and how some people don't properly methylate. It kind of hits on this, but so identical twins can have the exact same DNA, but a lot of times they're different in a lot of ways, and it may be due to these genetic marks, even though the genes are the same.
And this is something, Keoni, like you were kind of alluding to in a rodent study. We can see this. We can visibly see this when we break it down.
Oh yeah, we can see it in action, and the reason why we study with rodents is because we can do many generations with rodents, and rodents are a great, they're a great model for humans because they, the lifespan is what, like, I don't know, I'd say at the most 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whatever it may be, but anyway, you can see evidence of this in action within one generation.
Wow.
So so let's think about with epigenetic inheritance. Let's give some more examples. What may modify gene expression? Well, diet. We talked about that, right? If you're going to eat chips and dip all day, you're probably going to express your genes in a way that aren't going to serve you well, right? And if you keep doing that, you can probably pass some of that on to your offspring, like where it can change the way their genes are expressed. And what's really interesting, I'll just bring this up, but I can't back up. But if that goes on long enough, where you're eating chips and dips and you don't kill off your progeny line beforehand, then you may get some change or more mutations, right, in your DNA than you otherwise would, because it's a significant stress. Then I want to back up a little bit, because what we're finding in genetics is when an organism is under stress, and certain organisms do it better, but they're starting to find in a lot of other organisms, including ourselves, from what I understand, is when you're under stress, and what they'll do is they may put an organism under heat stress or whatever. What they find is certain regions of their DNA start switching around, and you can think about it as a bacteria being exposed to antibiotics, so to speak, right? Let's say it's being exposed to antibiotics. What does it have in its arsenal to help fight that off? Well, the DNA starts changing, moving around to try to get a sequence that can then
kind of rescue the situation.
Yeah, kind of rescue the situation. What's an example in humans? Well, when you're confronted with a virus, a novel virus, our immune system does something very similar to that, right? Create antibodies, try to find the right combination. It's kind of like a war that's constantly going on. The virus is changing, the immune system's changing to fight it off. And hopefully the immune system can get out enough antibodies to bind the antigens of the virus, and therefore your immune system can take care of it. That's going on and on. And once your immune system takes care of that, guess what? Now you have immunity. In general, you have immunity because you have already seen it.
Right. You've kind of developed that pathway of protection, or what your plan, or what you're going to carry out and do.
Right.
I think of that, the cytokine storm. Not that this is necessarily the best example or 100%. This is just really boiling it down, but maybe that's why you have that cytokine storm with the coronavirus, as your immune system kind of figures out or kind of reorganizes how are we going to attack and deal with this situation.
Yeah, that's right. It's like the last stand, so to speak. Think about cytokines, right? Cytokines are it's proteins.
Your little soldiers, yeah.
Yeah, it's like proteins or little little strings of peptides or whatever that are being, they all have to be made. It all goes back to the DNA, so to speak, to make all that.
Yeah.
Your cellular machinery gets revved up, and you get this storm of cytokines to help fight off the invader. So alcohol consumption, we know that that may be able to be transmitted later on. It certainly causes problems in the DNA and how the DNA is expressed. Environmental pollutants, psychological stress, all these things, lifestyle factors, can modify the epigenetic, not the genetic necessarily, but the epigenetic patterns of how genes are expressed. But over time, we're getting inklings that if this keeps happening, because it is a stress, it is the environment, that maybe you're going to get some mutations that go on there that may better able to help you cope with that stress later on. Yeah. All right. And we're not, it's just interesting. Like every different environment, the people that are going to do better there are going to have a little bit different change in their DNA. That'll, maybe it's some sort of mutation, or epigenetically they can cope with it a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be fascinating. And I know we kind of did this, I think his name's Scott Kelly, but the astronaut that spent like a year in space, Keoni.
Yep.
Just kind of what that looks like when we leave the confines of this tank that we've kind of formulated all of these theories off of. And
it happens almost immediately. I mean, a good example is you go into space, almost immediately your body's going, oh, we don't need bone anymore, get rid of it.
Right.
Get rid of it. Oh, don't need muscle anymore, get rid of it. It's almost like the body has this way of saying, let's take all this extra stuff we don't need now and put it towards something else, or get rid of it.
What gets kind of confusing to me, Keoni, is, so let's just use the bone building as an example. So like as a physical therapist, I know of Wolff's Law, which Wolff's Law is bone is built where areas of stress. So basically it's a respond, those osteoblasts that build the bone are basically, you put more pressure in that area, the osteoblasts are sent there. So it's kind of confusing to me as if it's like a chicken versus the egg sort of situation. Are the genes controlling that, or and then I guess I'm answering myself that this is the environment having an impact, because the environment is letting you know that we don't need this, and then the genes are responding accordingly. So I'll just shut up and let you continue.
Well, so you are talking about the environmental impact. You're in a different environment is causing the genes to respond in a different way.
Yeah.
Right. But what happens if you do it over time for generations upon generations, and you're able to survive and have offspring?
Right.
Then what happens?
Right.
Now you may be able to actually change the DNA. You may, based on, because you're not so much change the DNA. Well, yeah, it would. According to Darwin, any random mutation in that DNA that allows you to do better in that environment and pass on your genes, is you're going to find an organism that just, based on 100 generations or 1,000 generations ago, is doing very well in that environment now.
Yeah. Yeah. I look forward to the Gumby people that are traveling through space in a few hundred years.
Well, I tell you, this is one of the ways to really see evolution in action, especially with humans. I mean, if you really want to see it in action, if it doesn't kill us, which I think is going to kill us first, is when we send humans to Mars or to the moon, and we start having babies up there, and that grow up there and that are raised, you're going to see some significant genetic changes going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oof, I mean, because it's a completely different environment.
Yeah.
All right, so we talked about genetic inheritance, we talked about epigenetic inheritance. Well, what about, that's not all there is. There's also what's called behavioral inheritance. And basically, these are behaviors that are passed down genetically. So let me give you an example of what this may look like. And this is fascinating to me. So for example, in the bird world, there are certain birds that do these like impressive displays of dancing and whatever to get the girl, to get the female bird, so to speak. But how did that all begin? How did that behavior begin? And some of these dance moves put Michael Jackson to shame. It's like,
absolutely.
So is this just something that they were born with, boom, they can dance, you know, and they know how to do this display. Well, that doesn't make sense either. And what they're thinking is happening here is the mental capacity of a bird probably, I don't know, a million years ago, probably could do 2 dance moves. And whatever bird did this certain dance move, you know, all the other birds looked at and said, damn, he's getting all the girls, you know? So
He's
they're
getting
like,
all
well,
the
we
likes
should,
on TikTok.
right, he's getting all the likes on Facebook and all that. Whatever he's doing, he's, you know, it's good. And these other people, the other birds that can't get these dance moves, you know, they don't pass on their genes as well. So basically, so after, I don't know, a millennia or whatever, this bird's genes, now every bird in that species is doing these 2 dance moves. But at some point, after doing that for so long over the generations, it becomes innate. And when that becomes innate, that means they don't have to think about doing it anymore, so to speak, you know? Not that they are anyway, but it's still, I'm talking about if you have 2 dance moves that they learned either through their parents, but after generation and generation is learning by watching their parents, eventually it becomes innate where you can take these young birds and put them off by themselves without them being influenced by their parents, and they're still doing the dance.
Right. No
All
true
right?
education or example.
Right. And then once that dance becomes innate, guess what? It frees up their mental capacity to learn 2 more moves. Okay, so now the bird who has the innate but then decides to do some
He's doing the worm.
Doing the worm, so to speak, and it impresses the female bird even more, the female. She's going, oh man, this dude knows 3 moves. I'm hanging out with him. You know, and then they pass on their progeny. Eventually, over time, then that becomes innate. And then all of a sudden, some innovative bird, does a 4th dance move. And all the female birds are like, that's the man. We're going to hang out.
Yeah, this motherfucker's doing the cha-cha slide.
Yep. So eventually, once that becomes innate, it frees up more mental capacity. And then over millions of years, then you have these birds doing these crazy dances that, you know, to try to get the girl that, you know, you're just like, how did that become innate? And that's one theory of how it becomes innate. That's behavioral inheritance where it gets passed down. So other forms of that are like animals preparing for winter, like making a bed to hibernate or whatever. Birds making a nest. I mean, you know, how did that happen? You know, it's kind of the same theory here. Or migration of birds. You know, they weren't just born way back when and said, oh, well, we're going to fly to the North Pole today. You know, it's kind of.
They didn't go to university to learn how to build a nest.
Right. Or spiders spinning webs, you know. Anyways.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And here's an example also that we see in research. And this goes back to the mouse model. And this is basically separating mouse pups from their mother. So for a few hours each day, according to the study, they'd separate mouse pups from the mother. Well, this put stress on the mother. And it also seemed to put stress on the pups, because what happens is when they became adult mice, they showed abnormal social skills. This is kind of hitting on us, right? We just talked about this with humans. They are more anxious and they tended to be depressed. All right. And that separation, they were thinking, well, the mice, they like lick their pups and everything. And if they don't have that, they grow up to be, I don't know, socially handicapped, so to speak.
Yeah.
Just from one generation of that. Now these pups can pass that on, that anxious, socially handicapped behavior to their generation. And that's okay. So now they're not even in an environment that they get to raise their pups without pulling the research arm pulling the pups away. It's just being transferred on. That's one generation. So the great grandmother mouse who didn't get to lick her pup for 2 weeks, and now the pup is anxious and depressed and acting weird, you know, as that mouse grows up and has progeny, those generations, if that one was allowed to raise that mouse the way it wants to, those mice then are acting weird.
Yeah.
Being transferred. That's behavioral. That's a form of behavioral inheritance.
Absolutely. I mean, we see it clear as day in like when you do like a mental health screening, or you go see the doctor and they ask you about your father's history of this or your mother's history of this, and so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah, and it's important. You can see that, but that is behavioral inheritance. It says a lot. It it says it says something about like socioeconomic, you know, status too. Where you were raised means a lot. You know, what kind of food you're eating means a lot. You know, we'll talk. I'll just hit on it briefly at the end here, but it kind of relates to what we're seeing with the COVID, where certain population groups, based on economic hardships or where they live in places where they cannot social distance, it's almost impossible for them to do. Guess what? They're going to do worse,
Yeah.
of course. And so then we see that with the demographics that come out.
Yeah.
Um,
What's the fourth type, Keoni?
so the fourth type is structural inheritance. And this is really interesting because this kind of the main area of research of this is prions, and prions are proteins. And they're really well known for being the cause of diseases such as scrapie in like sheep and goats, and then mad cow disease, and in humans, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, right? These prions cause severe neurological problems, and they're basically proteins that can be inherited. All right. And from the from the examples I just gave, they're devastating. They can be passed on. They can be inherited through passed from mother to children, father to children, that type of thing. They can be passed on, and that's another form of inheritance. So we see this in the animal, in some of the like protozoa and stuff like that, where these prions actually help form structures in their bodies, like with the cilia in like the paramecium, the protozoans like paramecium, and the way a snail shell will spiral. It's all based on structural inheritance. Does it spiral to the left or to the right? It's based on the conformation of these proteins.
The prions isn't necessarily always a bad thing, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. I just wanted to bring that up because that's how most people have heard of them. They're
Gotcha.
not necessarily a bad thing. They do play a role, and they seem to play a role much more so than what we thought in evolution. So,
Do you know when the 4D book came out, Keoni, that kind of kickstarted this in your mind recently?
2000. I think the first edition was 2007. The revised edition was like 2014.
Man, it's just gonna be fast. It's just gonna be fascinating when we change it to 6D in 2050 or whatever we find out.
And I think we are going to see that. I definitely think we are going to see that. And when you really sit back and think about it, smacks you up the head. Of course, it's not all about the genes. It's not all about random mutations, and there is some pressure or direction for how we express those genes and how things are passed on, both behaviorally, structurally, epigenetically, and all that stuff. And a lot of people aren't aware of that.
Yeah.
Just a few examples, and let's end, because I know we've gone over a lot of time, and probably people are falling asleep and don't enjoy this as much as I do or you do. But anyway, so human examples, some stuff that we have. Roles, where does it play in humans? Well, there's something at the end of World War II called the Dutch famine, right? That's where the Nazis like kind of surrounded the Netherlands or whatever. And basically during that winter before World War II ended, the food rations were significantly cut for the people there. Any child that was in utero at that time had what they found 60 years later from just that short amount of time of cutting the food rations down. These children were born with significant increased risk of diabetes, obesity, schizophrenia, coronary heart disease 60 years later. Wow. So, a lot of these studies we can't do in humans, but we do have things like this that have happened. Mm-hmm. Significant change in the environment. Another study, Swedish scientists using 19th century historical records of harvest and food prices found that paternal grandfather's access to food in mid-childhood affected the mortality of his grandsons. I mean, that's fascinating, right? Yeah. So if your grandfather didn't get a whole lot of food, 150 years ago or whatever, when he was a child, or 100 years ago when he was a child, or great-grandfather, guess what? That can affect your mortality.
Yeah.
So, and the same is true for grandmothers. So grandmother, great-grandmothers, if again, a famine, that affects the mortality of their granddaughters. Sons of smokers that started smoking early in life have significantly higher body mass index. And then what we just talked about before, we see what what's going on now. Young people belonging to underprivileged classes, like living in developing countries or under conditions of social and political insecurity. Think about stress, right? We talked about how in certain organisms, stress, no matter what it is, starts changing the DNA around quite a bit. It's almost like there's, and I don't want to bring this up because I know this is going to talk about divine intervention, but it's almost like it's directed in a way. Let's scramble the DNA up so we can find a combination that will work for the progeny later on, so that we can pass on, right?
Right.
Because this stress is not ending and it keeps going on. But anyway, people that live in these underprivileged classes, that are exposed to hunger, definitely to toxic pollutants. Tons of research on toxic pollutants exposure and what it does to create marks in your DNA, and give you long-lasting effects for your well-being. And we're finding it's transgenerational, which has nothing to do with the DNA mutating, right? It's the marks, and they express the DNA in a little bit different way. Happiness studies. There's happiness studies in mice. Mice that grew up in an enriched environment with lots of things to play with just tend to do better. They tend to be less disease, less problems, tend to raise their pups in a better way, that type of thing. Whereas if they grow up in environments that are not, then you're having that like antisocial, weird social handicap behavior. And then last but not least, I think this kind of hits home with us because, if you look at the demographics to, what's going on here, usually the people that are suffering from COVID the most are the people that are from the underprivileged classes. And you see it around the world. And then you also see it in the elderly who are immune depressed or who really can't social distance well and are like, that's why you see it run rampant in cruise ships and in retirement communities because they're so crammed together. So anyway.
Keoni, if I came to you and I said, I have all this doom gloom now because my father had XYZ, my mother had XYZ, and we didn't have much growing up or this or that, whatever the situation may be, and I feel like I'm almost like I'm subject to my genetics. What would you kind of say about, how do I address that or kind of change my environment to use this to my advantage?
That's a great question. And here's the thing. This is what I would say. I would say, yeah, you, unlike me or other people, you probably started off this life at a disadvantage, right? So let's think about class systems. Like, you came from the poor class of people, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
Once you are in that, based on behavioral inheritance, based on cultural stuff that goes on there, it's very hard to get out of that and jump classes. It's very difficult, right? It's the rare person that can get out of that environment. And a lot of us like to say, oh, well, they're just lazy. They have so much going against them to get out of that. It's unreal. And the rare person that does, it's great, but it's a rarity. It's like one.
It's an anomaly for sure.
Yeah, it's 1 in a million. But what can you do? You have to make a conscious effort not to be caught up in that lifestyle. Right? You have to make a conscious effort at some point not to be caught up in lifestyle, which is very hard. If that's the culture you grew up with, that's what you're going to do. So I have a friend of mine who grew up on the wrong side of town, and he said, look, when I was growing up, there's one kid that we all used to make fun of because his mother would, after school, would lock him up and would not let him come out into the street and play, while all of us were selling drugs and doing stupid stuff. Most of us ended up in prison and yada 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 because that was the thing to do. The mentor to look up to was a drug dealer driving a nice car. This one kid made it out because his mom shut the door on that activity and made him study, and made him get his head right, even though he went through hell and felt like a outsider in the meantime. And I think this particular kid is now some big time lawyer, according to my friend, who's very, very successful. So it is doable, but you also have to wake up to what is going on. You have to know there's a problem first, and that's the issue.
Maybe that's the next iteration, the fifth of these types of genetics, is this kind of awareness.
Yeah, it's awareness of what is going on, and this stuff gets passed down. I mean, that's behavioral. That's kind of like behavioral inheritance, right? It's like the culture has a huge influence on it. It's very hard to jump class systems unless you can be educated and be made aware of what's going on.
Yeah.
So
It's a fascinating topic, really, Keoni. Thank you for bringing it and
yeah,
educating us on it.
yeah, no, I love it. It educates me when I talk about it. It is fascinating, but it hits us at every aspect. You know, we do need to be aware of this stuff and how it plays a role in how we express our genes and how we pass that information on.
Yeah. Any last little bit, Keoni? Anything we need to leave
Um,
a note on?
no, I don't think so. I mean, we'll be doing some more of these
Absolutely.
soon.
Hopefully
So
from space, as we're like Gumby people and reach that
yeah,
next
yeah,
iteration. It's just me and Keoni, the computer people. Our
right.
genes
I
have
mean,
passed on.
I will say this. I do want to get into some of the molecular details of like when we talk about, you know, the epigenetic marks and how they influence that. I find that stuff fascinating.
Yeah, that would be
We didn't really
fascinating.
hit on it too much, but except just talking about it briefly.
So part 2 coming soon.
Yep.